Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University. In our course, we are about to start examining various instructional approaches. In this video, let's get a brief overview of what these different instructional approaches are. Teaching is both an art and a science. One of the aspects of our art of teaching, which can be grounded in science, is the instructional approach or approaches that a teacher takes to help students learn in this teaching learning process. There are direct instructional approaches where teachers are very directly leading students through instruction. There are indirect instructional approaches, and these involve some type of activity where the students are exploring and discovering their way through different concepts. There are social instructional approaches where students in some way are working together in order to learn and understand and practice the content. There are also independent instructional approaches where students are pursuing the content independently. So maybe there's a project or there's an activity where the teacher is not as directing the process. Many teachers will engage in traditional lecture format in their classes. Many teachers also teach with and through technology. Some teachers will seek to engage students more heavily in technology and try to gamify their classrooms. Another approach some teachers take is to flip their classroom, in which their lecture is sent home, so to speak, through video, and then the classroom time is spent and reserved for hands-on and active learning strategies. Direct teaching is also known as explicit instruction, or whole class instruction, or teacher-led instruction, or even teacher-centered instruction. In direct teaching, the teacher tends to be at the center of everything. The teacher is the one who determines the pace of instruction. Many times this happens through lecture. Another primary type of teaching is indirect teaching, which is also known as student-centered instruction. In indirect teaching, the teacher creates an instructional sequence, and the students normally get to work more independently. Sometimes they work together. They work to construct their knowledge. They work to discover information. So it's also, in some cases, known as discovery learning. With direct instruction, the teacher is right at the heart of instruction. The teacher is at the center. That's why these are known as teacher-centered methods. With indirect instruction, the teacher is more of a facilitator. The teacher constructs activities and helps learners construct their knowledge based on their experiences in class. And that's why these are known as student-centered or student-focused methods. Realize that there are no clear-cut lines between direct and indirect instruction. Some techniques that a teacher can use will be more clearly defined as direct instruction. Some will be more clearly defined as indirect, but some methods can serve both as direct or indirect instruction. It depends on the techniques that the teacher uses and the way in which the teacher introduces and conducts those types of instruction. If an instructor is going to use direct instruction, we're talking about the instructor using traditional methods of teaching. The teacher will lecture, probably use a PowerPoint or other type of presentation system, and hopefully the teacher will ask students to take notes and embed some questions within the lecture period. So what are the good points or the advantages of direct instruction or lecture? One of the great points is that a teacher can cover a whole lot of content in a short period of time. And the reason for that is it's very predictable. The teacher's in control of the content, and the teacher is in control of how much time is being used to cover that content. Because of this, student achievement is normally pretty predictable and manageable too. Student activity in the class is pretty predictable. In the college world, we spend more time with direct instruction due to the maturity of the learners and the fact that we have to cover a whole lot of content in a short period of time. So then what are some of the disadvantages of lecturing? Well, one for sure is that student motivation is extrinsic. The students are not going to be internally, intrinsically motivated many times by the lecture format. The learner has very little control either over the content or the pacing of the content. They're just passive absorbers unless the teacher decides to involve other types of methods in addition to lecture, or if the teacher chooses to use a different type of lecture method. Unfortunately, creative and divergent thinking is normally pretty limited in a lecture format compared to the indirect methods of instruction. And finally, student self-esteem will not be advanced during a lecture because they're sitting there more as passive observers of the activity. What are some of the best practices for direct instruction or lecture? Here you can see a number of positive thoughts about practices that teachers can take to make direct instruction more effective. As you look through the list, realize that if you follow Gagne's 9-step model of teaching, you're doing all of these things, and they represent some of the best practices for direct instruction. So when should an instructor decide to utilize lecture? When is it most effective? Well, first, when the content is very straightforward, very clear, and well defined. Also, when that content needs to be mastered by all students because it's prerequisite to some future learning, and it just has to be mastered. Again, this is ideal to use direct instruction because the teacher can control the pacing and all of the activities that are involved. If the content would be difficult for students to really glean, if it was in more indirect instruction way, if it was more through discovery learning, those kinds of concepts really need to be lectured out to students. If the goal of the teacher is to integrate facts and concepts and different ideas, well, that integration would be a whole lot easier if the teacher really explained it rather than allowing students to discover it at a self-paced way on their own. And also, direct instruction is very effective if the goal is to, again, introduce prerequisite knowledge. Because if you're going to set up that prerequisite knowledge, that maybe then you can do an indirect instruction after. You can take a different approach. You can have some type of discovery learning. But that those preliminary thoughts need to be mastered first. In all of these cases, lecture is very effective. Research suggests that when a high degree of active learning has been explicitly planned, direct instruction is one of the most effective and efficient forms of teaching that there is. And that's why it's still used in the classroom to this day. If a teacher selects to use indirect instruction, the teacher will be utilizing a student-focused, more inquiry-based learning method. So, for example, a teacher might utilize a discussion format. The teacher could use a chart and ask students to chime in with different thoughts, maybe different attributes of something, and then use follow-up questions in which he or she probes the thinking of students and kind of guide them into discovery. The teacher might use cooperative learning. where students are working together to discover different aspects of the content. The teacher might use inquiry or discovery teaching and learning, which would be to a more high degree of discovering the concepts and also the relationship between the concepts. The teacher could use project-centered learning or case studies in which students are working either in small groups or individually and really applying what they've learned in order to discover more about the content. The teacher might use simulations or games or even game-based learning, all of which involve a whole different approach than a teacher directly lecturing and telling students the content and the relationship between various aspects of the content. The teacher in indirect instruction helps the students to discover it on their own. Why does indirect instruction work? Why is it effective? Well, for several reasons. First, it capitalizes on social interactions where students are working together in ways that you don't find in an entire class situation where people are just basically listening to an instructor. If the teacher plans well, the students start to manage their own learning in the process. In this way, the burden of learning is shifted from the lecturer over to the student in indirect instruction. If a teacher varies instructional approaches, it's a very good practice. And the reason is because it helps to address different learning styles of the students. And indirect instruction is a great way for a teacher to promote a more actively engaged classroom. For student-centered instruction to be most effective, the teacher has to carefully plan the transition between lecturing and the student-focused activities. The teacher in the indirect instructional part has to carefully define and design the tasks that the learners are going to perform. During this time, the teacher has to monitor the progress of the students. The teacher has to establish clear timelines and time limits and define what the outcomes are so the students know what to focus on. And the teacher has to ensure participation by all students, because if it's left unchecked in indirect instruction, students can kind of fall by the wayside a little bit and not be as active participants as they could be. And also, in order to make sure that this is going to happen with equitable participation, the teacher must establish student-to-student communication rules for the group activities that are going to follow. What could cause a lesson to fail? Well, if the teacher is lecturing, utilizing direct instructional techniques, the lesson can fail because the students were too passive. They were not actively engaged. They went off task. They grew bored with the way the content was being delivered. If an indirect instruction, more student-centered, focused lesson is going to fail, it may fail because the teacher did not do certain things. Maybe the teacher did not well define the tasks or provide enough structure. Maybe the teacher didn't monitor enough to make sure that all students were participating and were involved in the process. And maybe the teacher just didn't hold students accountable enough for their participation in the activities. What type of instructional approaches should an instructor use? What does the research say about it? In a 2017 study, the researchers analyzed standardized test scores of over 500,000 students. And as part of the research, they suggested that there are better educational outcomes. In other words, students will learn a whole lot more if they receive a blend of teacher-directed and inquiry-based learning, both direct and indirect learning methods. Another notable researcher, Marzano, who is known for performing research studies in 7 through 12, noticed that for years researchers have reported on the effects of various instructional strategies and how they impacted student learning. But he came to the conclusion that when you look at it, they vary from researcher to researcher, from research setting to research setting. So which teaching methods are the most effective? Marzano concluded that it's not the method as much as how a teacher uses the strategy, and that improves the effectiveness of the teaching strategy. So to utilize more than just one type of method or one method only is a great idea, but it depends on how the teachers use them to really impact effectiveness in the classroom. So what should a teacher do in terms of selecting the most appropriate instructional methods? Well, first of all, become well skilled in the use of both direct and indirect methods of teaching. A teacher should use mixed instructional approaches and not just rely on one. A teacher should try to increase the active learning, especially when they're using those teacher-focused methods, those direct methods of teaching. And also, studies strongly suggest vary your methods of teaching often during instruction. If you do this, you'll be a much more effective teacher. Thank you for watching this brief introduction to different types of methods of teaching. Throughout the rest of our course, we're going to examine some historic practices, more teacher-centered, more direct methods, and see how we can improve them, how we can modernize them, how can we make them more effective. Then we'll also explore newer ways of teaching, more indirect instruction, more student-focused methods of instruction, and how we can capitalize on those in order to engage our students more in the class. And ideally, you'll be able to blend both the direct and indirect instruction in your teaching.